The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Can democracy thrive if people don't openly and honestly debate the big issues of the day? Can our democracy prosper if freedom of speech goes too far sometimes? Tonight, as part of our joint initiative between TVO and the Toronto Star, we're examining the state of public debate in everyday democratic life. First up, he's the president of Central European University, but you may remember him better as the former leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. Either way, Michael Ignatieff will be with us on why he's still a staunch defender of the liberal democratic tradition against any more radical options. It's Thursday, March 4th, and that's tonight on the Democracy Agenda. Most academics who study politics do so from a vantage point that's more study than politics. That is not the case, of course, for Michael Ignatieff. He was in mid-career as a highly respected political thinker when he rolled up his sleeves and waded into the real political arena to helm the Liberal Party of Canada from 2009 to 11. Today, he's back in academia, and his profound interest in the nature of liberal democracy endures. He is the rector and president of the Central European University and joins us now from Vienna, Austria, where I hope we find you thriving and doing well. Let us start with this. In the last 2 decades of the 20th century, things looked really good for liberal democracy. It seemed to be in ascension in so many places of the world. But as we compare that with the first 2 decades of the 21st century, things do not seem to have gone as well. Why do you think?
Well, Steve, I quarrel a little bit with your starting premise, and for a reason. If you look at after 1989, it's a much less euphoric story. Think about Bosnia, think about Yugoslavia, think about the ways in which democracy came to that part of the world. It came in the form of ethnic cleansing, majority rule, killing others to create your own ethnically homogeneous state. So right from the beginning, from 1989, the transition out of communism into liberal democracy was much more difficult than we ever supposed. But there was a period, it is true, in which democracy seemed to consolidate in great places like South Africa. Ghana would be a great story. In Central and Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, they all seem to be telling a good news story. In the 90s, it was just possible to think that Russia might transition in a positive way. It was also even possible, I remember thinking it myself, that as China liberalized, it would produce political pluralism. All of those hopes, there you're right, all of those hopes are gone.
And I guess the question is, why is there such a crisis of confidence among small L liberals worldwide these days? You say we've kind of lost the confidence to tell the stories of our past. What do you mean by that?
Well, my view is that liberalism has told itself a story that associated itself with progress, technological progress, economic progress, lifting people up out of poverty, would consolidate democracy. Liberals, and by liberal, let me also make it clear, I don't mean liberal with a capital L, like a party political label. I mean anybody who believes in majority rule, minority rights, constitutions, a free press, separation of powers. That's what I mean by liberal democracy and liberalism. And that story was connected to a historical story of progress right from the 18th century onwards. I think the thing that's in crisis is that the liberal story has been separated from the story of progress. We're not sure that progress is is moving in the right direction. We're extremely concerned about environmental destruction. We're extremely concerned with growing inequality. Suddenly, the association between liberalism and progress no longer seems to make sense to us. And I think that puts liberals everywhere on the back foot, despite the paradox that it's been liberal democratic societies that delivered more progress, more equality, more human betterment than any other system of government in the world.
Now, the next set of questions I'm going to ask you relate to a piece that you wrote in Liberties last fall, and you are not all that optimistic, if I read you right. And let me just read an excerpt of that right now, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, the graphic, if you would. Radical environmentalism, reinforced by COVID-19, has become the glamorous pessimism of our time. It has become an identity and a style, an opportunity to demonstrate one's own righteousness, to express disgust at politicians, to give shape, however dark, to time. Better a master narrative that predicts doom than no narrative at all. To dissent from this view is to take upon oneself a whole lot of trouble. My own dissent is in fact pretty limited. I do not dispute the facts, of course. Shame on those who do. I dispute the attitude. What I dislike is the pessimism, the misanthropy, the wholesale indictment of progress and humanism, the tendentious rewriting of modern history, the impatience with liberal half measures, which I insist are the only ones that have made any constructive difference. Okay, so maybe I need to fix my own premise that I went in with here, which is I hear a pessimism kind of jumping out there. I know you personally don't want to be, but there seems to be a radicalism in the air which I think you would not sign on to. And I wonder how well you think that radicalism and liberal democracy, as you've just described it, how well they mix.
I just don't think they mix at all, Steve. I think that's the key point I'm making here. If you're a liberal, and let me again make it clear, you can vote conservative and still be a liberal in my sense of the word. That is someone who just believes in markets, freedom, good government, limited government. This is a broad church here, but the core belief of any of those kinds of people, and they vote for different kind of parties, is that incremental political steps matter. And what I'm finding difficult about the environmental movement is this kind of pessimism, we're all going to die, the misanthropy, human beings are a plague on the planet, the sense that small measures, that is, taking out, separating your garbage and trying to buy green fuels and all the little steps that we make in order to be environmentally sensitive, that none of this matters because we haven't got enough time and the world's going to hell in a handcart. This stuff, I think, is misanthropic pessimism that does us no good at all. And I'll tell you why, because it's not a politics. It's essentially a kind of religious view. And I didn't do so well in politics, but I believe in politics. I believe that what you want with a sensible environmentalism is a politics. That means a politics that makes choices, that understands we're all citizens here, so you can't demonize, Western Canadians who pump the oil. You can't demonize people who are dependent on high fossil fuel energies. You have to work with them as citizens to get us to transition to a better place. And then people will then come back and say to me, well, Mr. Ignatieff, that's all very well, but we don't have time. We always have time in politics. We have to make time. I don't dispute how serious the environmental crisis is, but I think we make it worse by this kind of fashionable, pessimistic despair that is religion, not politics. And we need more politics, more discussion, more coming together, more of those little compromises that are so difficult to get through. And I say this with some feeling. When I look at what has happened, for just one example, the amount of renewable energy that is on the market, that is no longer having to be subsidized, that is actually pushing stuff onto the grid and reducing the pressure on the environment, I'm astounded at the progress that has been made, in fact, using market signals. This kind of liberal, moderate gradualism is being trashed by radical environmentalism in the name of a religious indictment of our wickedness that I just think gets us nowhere. That's why, I'm actually extremely optimistic that markets, good government, democracy can deliver the goods. And at the moment, we're facing a radical environmentalism that basically says democracy won't be able to do it, the market won't be able to do it because capitalism is the problem. And, finally, politics, oh, those politicians, we can't trust them. This stuff will get us nowhere. We need an environmental politics that gets results. And I'm a firm believer in that.
What is the source of this radical environmentalism you're talking about?
Well, it's a good question. I think people, in a way, Steve, they like the pleasures of denunciation. They like the pleasures of moralism. They like the identity that goes with radical politics. So that if I sit down and say what I've just said to you, they look at me with a kind of weary, slightly condescending view. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? He's an old liberal over the hill of a certain generation. He just doesn't get what's really happening. I do get what's happening. I just think that in a modern world, the only solutions are politics. You have to sit down with Alberta. You have to sit down with Saskatchewan. You have to understand that environmental politics in our country is a national unity issue. Environmentalism is not the trump card that clears the table. You have to trade it off against how much national disunity can you stand at a given moment. And that kind of trade-off talk, a lot of environmentalists think is, oh, you just clearly don't understand how serious this is. I do understand how serious it is, but we have to have a politics as opposed to a religious conversation in which I get cast out as a heretic, and I'm in the damned as opposed to the saved.
I do take your point. I also wonder, though, how much liberal democracy worldwide has to take responsibility for the pickle we're in as much as it has promised a lot. It has promised a lot of equality, which we don't have. It has promised a lot of economic growth, which we don't have. It has promised too much peace around the world, which we don't have. Are liberal democracies now paying the price of overpromising?
Oh, I think we've overpromised. I think that's sure. And I don't want, the besetting sin of my kind of liberalism is complacency. We don't see the inequality. We don't see the environmental despoliation. We don't see the exclusion. We don't see, what's happening in Aboriginal Canada. Well, I think there's a liberalism that sees all those things, but simply says, what's your alternative? Do you fancy authoritarian solutions? Do you fancy the authoritarian populism that we've just seen defeated in the United States? I mean, it's not that liberalism is free of fault, but I've yet to see a political system capable of generating what liberal democracy has generated since 1945. Again, the example that I keep using is the energy transition. We're in the middle of it, but it's astounding what's happened. And when I think, for example, when I think back to being a graduate student in 1970, the first Earth Day, I remember it vividly, that picture of the globe that's still so moving to me. That was the beginning, in a sense, of a mass movement of environmental consciousness. It's only 50 years old. And, maybe you only say this when you get to my age, it's only 50 years old. But 50 years is a tiny space of time in terms of the progress we've made, the progress we're making. And I think the environmental consciousness that is now absolutely a commonplace in liberal democratic discourse is a floor upon which we can build to make enormous progress in the future.
Looking good for 73, I must say, since you brought it up.
Don't rub it in. Don't rub it in.
Okay, moving on. Ian Buruma, the Dutch writer, former New York Times Review of Books editor, he had this to say about some of those very questions you just raised, as in, would we prefer a more authoritarian look at things? Some people would. Here's what he had to say. More and more people feel that a set of values is being imposed on them, a civilization loosely based on the Enlightenment, on liberalism, on the classics, and above all, on whiteness. The claim that these values are universal is obnoxious to many Americans who feel excluded from them. What do you make of that claim?
Well, I'm going to do the on the one hand, on the other. But on the one hand, there's simply no doubt that the books that universities have taught for generations have not included the great classics of Black and Asian and Muslim thought. Okay, no question about it. There is no question, furthermore, that in our history of Canada, we haven't understood the enormous harm done to Aboriginal Canadians, in the same way that I think America is still reckoning with the enormous human damage done to whites, but chiefly to Blacks, obviously, as a result of slavery. We have to own all these histories, and a liberalism that is honest and conscious of itself is always trying to face the painful truths of the past and then incorporate those truths into the future that we teach our children. Okay, that's on the one side. But on the other side, the losses when you start dismissing the great classics of European culture and civilization as simply white, the losses to young Black or Asian or minority or Aboriginal students when you start saying, don't bother with Shakespeare or Milton because these are white guys from an imperial past. You don't need to worry about it. I'm not going to inflict Shakespeare on anybody, but I'm not going to allow any young Black or Asian or minority person in my class to say, I'm not going to Shakespeare because I've been told it's an imperial leftover. I'm not going to apply for the Rhodes Scholarship because I've been told Rhodes was an imperialist. I'm not going to listen to what Thomas Jefferson said about we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I'm not going to listen to Thomas Jefferson because he held slaves. The thing that bothers me here, Steve, is we want to have people holding two thoughts in their mind at the same time. John A. Macdonald founded our country. John A. Macdonald was also responsible for the creation of the Aboriginal school system, which did enormous harm. We can hold both thoughts in our mind. We don't need to knock the statue over and try to pretend that John A. Macdonald had nothing to do with the creation of a country in which we take pride. And there's no reason we shouldn't be proud of John A. Macdonald. Equally, we should never forget the harm that he did to Aboriginal Canada. We can hold two thoughts in our heads. That's being an adult.
Well, there will be those watching this right now who will say, Mr. Ignatieff, you are not being nearly woke enough considering the times in which we live. You want to plead guilty to that?
I'm too old to plead guilty to any of this. I'm stuck with what I believe. I have a deep loyalty to a certain version of historical truth. And let's never pretend that facing up to the truth of our country's history is anything other than hard. I've sat with Aboriginal leaders who told me things that just shocked me. I found it hard to sit in the room. Their version of Canadian history was so hard for me to listen to. It was painful. We were all at the edge of tears. But that's to live in truth. That's what it means to live in a country and share it with people. And that's what we have to do. I don't know whether I'm woke or not woke. I could care less anymore. But what I do care about is listening to Aboriginal leaders contesting my view of the country. I'm happy to sit there all day and defend John A. Macdonald, not for what he did to Aboriginal Canadians, but what he did to create the country I love. And then I want to create a country where they feel this is their country too. And that's work that is not done. It's not finished. But the point is we're stuck with each other.
Well, to that end, in our last couple of minutes here, I do want to return to what you might have to say to the 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump in the last U.S. election and who do not necessarily see themselves as part of a digital, diverse, gender fluid future, if I want to put it that way. Many of them prefer a world that they know and that is familiar to them. What can liberal democracy say to that group of people to make them feel more part of a whole?
Steve, I don't know what to say. I know what not to say, which is to pretend they don't exist, shut them down when they express their views about sexuality, about marriage, about race, about gender, about the whole thing. You can't have a country if you just dismiss 74 million people. I don't know what to say positively. I mean, the only thing I think you have to say patiently, quietly, relentlessly is the core of a democracy is a peaceful transition of power. You can't run a democracy at all if there's an epistemological debate about something as basic as the transition of democracy itself. And so that's when you can't trade away. You just say, look, I'm sorry, you lost. And I hope that you will come back and compete in the electoral cycle in 2024. And if your candidate wins, fine. I mean, you got to reanimate, I think, in those 74 million people, a faith in democracy itself. That's what's so critical about what Trump has been doing, is been cast aspersion on the very system that gives them, the excluded, the people who lost, the chance to win again. And then on our side, the liberal side, we got to stop saying, you know, if a conservative Republican comes to power in the United States, we've got to stop saying this is the end of civilization as we know it. The American Republic's been going on since 1776. It's had some terrible presidents, some dangerous presidents, some demagogic presidents, and it's still going. And so both sides of the argument have got to accept the finality of the results and live with that side taking power. And that's what has to happen. I don't think there's any possibility we're going to live in, you know, harmony and sing Kumbaya, but we can accept the core realities of democracy, which are the peaceful transfer of power from one group to another every 8 years. And that applies in Canada, it applies everywhere. And that's what was so terrifying about what happened in January. Suddenly, after 200 years, the most fundamental principle of democracy was contested, and the most fundamental reality of democracy was contested. And that was the most serious crack in the fabric of democracy in my lifetime. And I hope I never see it happen again.
From your lips to God's ears, as they say. Mr. Ignatieff, that's our time, and we're always grateful when you make time for us here at your old stomping grounds at TVO, and I look forward to doing this again in person with you someday.
Pleasure. Thanks so much, Steve. It's great to talk to you.
Democracy and freedom of speech go hand in hand, right? But when do my rights to say what I want clash with your right not to be offended? Or is that a false choice? Lots to figure out during this joint initiative between TVO and the Toronto Star, the Democracy Agenda on how much freedom of speech Canadians want. So let's welcome, and as is our tradition, we'll introduce our guests from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in Brooklyn, New York. There's Irshad Manji, author most recently of Don't Label Me, an incredible conversation for divided times. She's also the founder of Moral Courage College. And back here in Ontario's capital city, in the Junction, Reverend Michael Coren, author most recently of Reclaiming Faith, Inclusion, Grace, and Tolerance. He's also an ordained cleric in the Anglican Church of Canada. In Scarborough, Shri Paradkar, a Toronto Star race and gender columnist. And in East York, Jonathan Kay, Canadian editor and podcaster at the online platform Quillette. And we are delighted to continue this now, I think, is this our fourth time? I think our fourth time with the Toronto Star doing this initiative. Shri, we're really enjoying it a lot, and thank you for your participation in it. Before we actually get to the matter at hand, you are going to forgive me because we want to, I'm just going to kfel a little bit here, okay? That's a technical term. 26 years ago on this channel, we did a show called Studio 2. And every Tuesday night, we saw two quite brilliant, quite wonderful people exercising their free speech rights to the benefit of our viewers. And we thought we'd just take a little jaunt down memory lane. Sheldon, if you would.
The Americans are losing the drug war. Instead of fighting morality on the ground, they're just giving in and saying, make the whole thing legal. Simply won't do.
Well, what won't do is a repressive drug policy, because that's the kind of policy that fosters a society in which people do thumb their nose at the law. People break the law and feel absolutely no sense of culpability because the popular culture and law are in such conflict with one another. And that is the conservatives' nightmare.
That was a wonderful segment we called Friendly Fire, and it was definitely fiery and mostly friendly. And we're absolutely delighted to get...
Steve, you doctored that because I had a full head of hair back then, and so you've changed that just to hurt me.
Well,
yeah, and Michael, I had a mustache. All right, so we've changed. We've both changed.
Anyway, I think this is the first time you two have been back on television in 25 years, so we're delighted to make that happen, and it's great to see you two back on TVO. I do want to start, though, by asking, and Irshad, get us started here. Can you compare the climate in which you tried to exercise your free speech today compared to back then? What's different?
Oh, Steve, no, I don't think I can compare the climate. For one thing, there was no social media at the time that Michael and I did our friendly fire debates, and that is a world of difference already. But I will tell you that shortly after those debates, I hosted a program on City TV. Remember City? When it was still in its cutting edge phase. And it was a show about gay and lesbian, transgender, and queer lives. And part of that show, Steve, the most popular segment, was something called Tell It to the Q, in which we would take pretty offensive emails and voicemails that we received, and I would respond to them. And on top of that, other viewers would respond. So we would be, before the Vox Populi era, we curated conversations that did not exist before. And I have to tell you, I look at those segments today and I think that is the kind of world we should still be living in. Today, all we really get are people who are resentful about being told that they're haters, and then labeling those who tell them that they're haters, labeling those people haters at the same time.
Michael, how about to you? Comparison of the climate back then versus today?
Well, I think Irshad was very perceptive. The most fundamental change is social media. It's empowered people, and empowering people, there's both a positive and a negative. It allows all sorts of people to express their view, but it doesn't guarantee those views will be informed, kind, tolerant. So there's some very dark information and opinion out there. It's not as bad as some people say. People can be muted, people can be blocked. I try to use Twitter in a different way if I can. We can call it a crisis if you like, but I would prefer to describe it as a challenge. There was a time when minority voices were unheard. We didn't call it a crisis back then. If Palestinians spoke about their narrative and were accused of anti-Semitism, we didn't say, oh, well, that's a crisis. We have to deal with it. We simply tolerated that. The status quo dominated everything. Times have changed, and I welcome them. Now, in that change, there is, of course, a breathing of the revolution that can cause problems. There are innocent people who have been targeted. There are vulnerable people who have been targeted. There are those people who are offended because they want to be offended. But within that, I think we are creating a more courteous, balanced, and just society where free speech genuinely means freedom, because there's context, there's wealth, there's privilege, there's race, there's history. It's not just everyone having a voice. We have to look to the past and to the present and, of course, to the future.
Jonathan, do you feel as free today to express your opinions as you did, say, 25 years ago?
I feel free. I've never been censored. But I'm a little bit of a special case. I'm privileged. I've been in the media a long time. My concern is more for people who are younger, who are starting out their careers, especially in anything to do with journalism or academia, and who don't have that privilege and who know that they can end their career with a single tweet. I think the biggest change has been that when I was starting my career, when I started to write about these issues in the early 2000s, it was widely acknowledged that the biggest threat to free speech was on the side of government. And so we looked at human rights tribunals, we looked to hate speech laws, and it was just assumed that the model of censorship that we were fighting was Big Brother. And I don't think that's the case anymore. In fact, it probably hasn't been the case for 10 or 15 years. Government is largely a bystander to many of the arguments that people are now having about cancel culture and free speech and such. I've been to, this is before COVID, I've been to conferences where YouTubers and stuff, they would argue about free speech. And what was interesting is the subject of government censorship never came up. It was all about like, what's Jack Dorsey doing at Twitter? What's Zuckerberg doing at Facebook? What's Tumblr doing? What Reddits are being permitted on that website? So you kind of have like half a dozen guys in Silicon Valley who are deciding what you can say on social media. That's the biggest change, is not left-right. It's the change from government oversight from the marketplace of ideas to largely corporate oversight. And what's weird is that leftists are cheering on these multi-billionaires and urging them to have more power to censor views they don't like. So you have this weird coalition between self-styled progressives and some of the richest people on the planet. That to me is one of the biggest transformations we've seen.
Sri, how about you? Do you feel in this supposedly free and democratic society that you are able to express yourself as much as you'd like to?
Absolutely. In Canada, especially, I feel that given the topics that I write about, I have never faced government interference of any kind at all. And I think for the most part, most of us go around our lives, go about without worrying about whether we are being tapped, whether our private messages are being surveilled. So I would say, yeah, the state of free speech in this country is really good. However, I do think we need to be vigilant about the fact that it's not the same for all journalists. You know, there was the Oneida journalist called Carl Dockstader, for instance, in September. He was arrested and banished by the police from the Land Back Lane protests in near Caledonia. And in December, the charges were dropped because there was no reasonable chance of a conviction. Mm-hmm. So we do have to be really vigilant about who's being surveilled, whose rights, what obstructions exist, how are protesters being treated. So there are free speech threats, but personally, I don't face them.
I'm so interested in all of those answers because we're going to share some numbers now from a survey that we just did last month. This was an online survey done for The Agenda pertaining to free speech, 1,500 respondents. And the question asked was, how comfortable are you sharing your opinions with, and then we have a variety of subjects here. How comfortable are you sharing your opinions with friends? 69% of people say, yes, they're comfortable sharing their opinions with friends. How about with your parents? Well, now we're fewer than half the people. 46% say yes. How about with workmates or schoolmates? Fewer than a third of people feel comfortable in those circumstances. And how about Canadians sharing their views in public? Fewer than 1 in 5 felt comfortable sharing their views with the public. Now, according to the Democracy Index survey in The Economist, we in Canada are living in the 5th best democracy in the entire world. But when that small a number of people feel comfortable expressing themselves in public, I've got to ask the question, okay, Rev Corin, start us off here. How good should we feel about that?
We should never feel particularly good about anything. I think the vaccination issue has told us that. We can be complacent. Look, there's perception and there's reality. And I think there is a certain chill taking place. Jonathan made the point earlier. And by the way, we have to distinguish between the Western world and the non-Western world. There are parts of the world where journalists aren't allowed to say anything at all. People aren't allowed for expression either. But in Canada, there is a certain feeling, I think, that the people have been almost convinced that if they speak their mind, not even particularly offensively so, they could be in trouble. I don't think that's the reality generally. Now, there are excesses, as I mentioned earlier. I've seen them. But I'm an aberration in many ways, in that I went back to university 5 years ago as an old person. And for 4 years, I saw various colleges at the University of Toronto. I have to tell you, very little had changed. The kids were probably nicer than when I originally went to university. They worked harder. But free speech didn't seem to be a major issue. People were still expressing themselves. But I would agree there is a feeling out there that if I speak my mind, I'll get in trouble.
Irshad, I wonder if you could follow up and bring into it the American point of view as well, because you've obviously lived in the States for some time. A recent survey in the U.S. suggested 62% of Americans are afraid to share their political views. Do you notice a difference between the two countries on either side of the border on this front?
Not in the sense of fear. People do live with fear today. Some are resentful about it. Some have simply resigned themselves to it. And, you know, we talked just briefly moments ago about social media. Obviously, given that, you know, one tweet could mean not just character assassination, but frankly, you know, the loss of your job, and certainly the elimination of a healthy reputation up until that point, you know, people do worry about what's going to come out of their mouths. And the other point to make about all of this is that we are living in a time of very low social trust, by which I mean not just trust between citizens and government, but frankly, trust between and among people. People generally believe that if we are going to say anything that's going to tweak somebody else's nose, even inadvertently, that discussion will instantly become a debate. And I have seen, Steve, with my own eyes and with my own ears, have heard people don't feel comfortable with debate. Only the loudest, most extreme voices go after debate. They you know, foment it. But everybody else who's basically more interested in solutions and getting on with their day than in, you know, bogging themselves down with their egos, most people actually fear having discussions turned into debates, and therefore will think twice before even launching a discussion about something that could be complicated enough to warrant a debate.
Sri, what do you think it says about the state of free speech in Canada when apparently fewer than 1 in 5 of us feels comfortable expressing their views in public?
Some of that could also, I would like to see how that would compare to maybe 5 or 10 years ago, because a lot of people are simply not comfortable being open in public, whether it is because of the pushback they're going to get or whether it's just self-consciousness. To some level, I think this is also about self-censorship. And self-censorship is not necessarily a bad thing if it means that you are about to say something that could be bigoted, racist, misogynistic, and you are stopping yourself to self-reflect upon it. So that's not such a bad thing. A little bit of self-reflection and thinking through consequences is a good thing. If we are talking in terms of debate, I have to agree with Irshad that I don't even believe debate is the best way to solve these problems, because it's not, a debate is not necessarily a place of trust where you don't begin with any kind of a common ground. Whereas on a person-to-person interaction level, yes, you have a certain maybe relationship and you can begin with that. Social media may not be the best place, but often that's where a lot of pushback happens, because especially if it is by traditionally marginalized people who've never had access to those so-called debates or discussions. And this is one place that they had that access, and they're using that access point to push back. And in return, what would be nice is if people who have never been challenged before stop to listen and ask why. Why is it that somebody is pushing back? Is what they're saying actually not right? Instead, what happens is if you're used to never being challenged, you get invested in a certain narrative, and then you are not interested in change or contrition or reflection.
Sri, can I just quickly push back on just one point that you make there? I think it's very true that some people have never been challenged and don't want to be. But I would suggest it is equally true today that all kinds of people who are told that they are privileged want to understand what that means, how that works in their lives. Often, though, when they ask why, and they ask it publicly, they are told, it is not my job to educate you. And so they get slapped down, not once, but often twice and beyond. There's a point at which that becomes humiliation. And that is when it begins to sting and when it curdles into something that we might call, much later on in the process, resentment and radicalization. So it is equally incumbent upon those of us who have been told, let me just finish, Michael, please. We have those of us who have been told that now we have access, let's use it, to the utmost. It's equally incumbent upon us to ensure that we're using these sorts of platforms with grace and with some humility, because that is the best way for us to get heard.
Let me just suggest here, Shri, you should come back on that. Then we need to hear from Jonathan and then Michael. Go ahead, please, Shri.
Yes, I think we could, I think all public conversation could be more gracious, but it's also, it is an unfair reality that it is the burden of the most oppressed to raise their voices against that oppression. I don't count myself as one of those oppressed, just to get that out of the way. However, how many times are you going to explain basic concepts like white privilege? If you can Google that and get extremely thoughtful, broad-based understanding of it, it's really not the job of a person on Twitter to be explaining white privilege over and over again. And there is a point of exhaustion. So I do have some compassion with that exhaustion too.
John Kay.
Look, white privilege exists. Steve, you had me on a show a couple of years ago, and I remember you pulled this stunt where you said, point to the person who has the most white privilege. And I think people either pointed to you or to me. I pointed to myself. I think it exists, though I agree with Ershad that if you're going to beat people over the head with it constantly, including, by the way, people who are not that privileged, like you see examples of people who are very poor, struggling, unemployed, working class white people who are being hectored by upper middle class people of all races about how privileged they are because of the color of their skin. Meanwhile, they can't feed their kids and they're living out of their car. I don't think that's like a useful, totalizing moral framework. And to say, oh, well, we're exhausted from talking about white privilege, there's a lot of really underprivileged people who are exhausted by being hectored about it. So I think there's a balance to be had there. The statistics you had before about whether people can say what they feel, the problem with those meta statistics is there's really two kinds of societies right now. One of the reasons I like to do things like play disc golf and go board gaming and stuff is I like to meet people who are off Twitter and who don't live in that universe. And what I love about those societies is like they're very casual and they're high trust environments. I think it was Ershad and Michael, they were talking about this issue. And in high trust environments, you can talk candidly about this stuff. You can make jokes. I was on the disc golf course and some guy said, oh man, he's pretty good for a little Chinese guy. And I mean, it was a mixed race group of people and they were all laughing and having fun. And if you said that on Twitter, you'd lose your job. So you have these environments of like, sort of ordinary people who don't spend their life on Twitter or on university campuses who, they're just, I don't think they feel especially censured. I think they can say what they want. I think they can joke as they please because they're in high trust environments. But then you get in highly anonymized situations like Twitter or in professional situations like on campuses or in activist organizations or literary organizations where you say one wrong syllable and that's it, your career's over. So I'm not sure a single statistic can cover these two milieus. And frankly, I like the milieu that exists in ordinary life. It's one of the reasons that I'm trying to get off Twitter and spend more time doing things like playing disc golf where you can just interact as ordinary, high-trust human beings.
Michael Korn.
To respond to what Jonathan said, I don't play disc golf, forgive me, but he's right. There is, if you like, a real world. I know it's a clumsy term, but there's a real world and the alternative. And most of what I do as a cleric is mixed with people who simply don't use social media. They don't use Twitter, and they're going through the real natural existence of everyday life. He also made a valid point about class. In the UK, for example, in Britain, a group that now is causing great concern is white working class young men, boys. They can't tick any of the boxes, but they're often living in terrible conditions, facing crime, drugs, and so on, and they're not really being listened to. But Ershad, I know what you're saying, Ershad, and it comes out of a great place of compassion. There are some people, certainly, who will beat someone up for simply asking a question. How dare you not know the answer? But not everybody. I mean, I had, on a personal level, quite a change of view about 7 years ago, and a lot of that came into fruition through personal conversation by reaching out to people who probably had a fair reason to say to me, shut up, but they didn't. They actually walked with me and helped me and taught me and listened to me. We're all part of this, and I think it's inevitable. There is on the right and the left an extremism that is incredibly intolerant. It represents a fringe. In the mass middle, this might sound banal, but in the mass middle, most people, I don't believe, behave in that way. I think there is a desire to learn and to listen. And one last point. I realize that sometimes people can be intolerant in response. Why don't you know that already? But these are often people who have been effectively silenced for not just a decade, not just a generation, but throughout history. So we must allow a little bit of pushback. But I would agree, when it comes to vulnerable people, kids, students being attacked, losing their jobs for one phrase, one expression, no, unacceptable.
And Michael, just real quickly, it's precisely because the people with whom you engaged listened and responded and developed that relationship with you. That is a big part of the reason that you felt comfortable changing. If they were in your face, insulting you, mocking you, ridiculing you, it would have been only too natural for you to become that much more defensive and either walk away or lash back. This is my point. Right. The way we use our freedom of speech matters at least as much as what we say.
Let me throw some new numbers out here as well, and I'll get the four of you to chew into these for a second. Board 3, please, Sheldon, if we could here. Okay, limits on free speech. Freedom of speech does not guarantee freedom from social consequences. 91% of people surveyed agreed with that notion. People who make racial slurs ought to be stopped from speaking. 85% of people agree with that. The government needs to regulate hate speech on social media. 3/4 of people agree with that notion. Radical ideas should be censored for the public good. 53% of people agreed with that idea. And finally, people that express offensive ideas should lose their jobs. 48% of people surveyed agreed with that. John Kay, what stands out for you on that list?
Well, the idea that 48% of people who express offensive ideas should lose their jobs. I'm going to go back to something Ershad said. What happens when you take somebody who, they say something offensive, and I'm not talking about something like completely over the top. Like I'm not talking about Holocaust denial or genocide advocacy. I mean, just like crazy stuff. I'm talking about things that are just sort of like, ordinary, everyday, politically incorrect things, and you say you're going to lose your job. Does that person who loses their job go home and say, wow, I really need to educate myself about intersectionality? This period of unemployment is a great time to watch some videos by Robin DiAngelo. Thank you. Thank you for giving me this period of reflection. No, of course not. They're going to become more vested in whatever ideological vector took them to, and it may have been no ideology. I mean, sometimes people just say casually intolerant stuff. And one thing that I object to is the idea that any form of intolerance is itself kind of like tantamount to criminal activity. Like, I know people who just, they're gay people and they don't particularly like being with straight people, or some guy, he had a bad experience in Central Asia and he doesn't like Uzbeks, or, it happens. Like, not everybody, some people don't like redheads. People are irrational and tribal, and there are people going around with all of these irrational ideas in their head. It's always going to be there because humans are tribal creatures. We shouldn't be regulating thoughts. What we should be doing is making sure those people don't act on those views when they make decisions in their workplace. They shouldn't be bigoted when they make decisions, or when they rent an apartment, or when they decide who's going to be their neighbor. That should be wrong. But if a person, if a gay guy doesn't like straight people, that's his right. I've never understood this idea that we have to extirpate all forms of intolerance from human brains. Human beings are coded evolutionarily to be wary, to be tribalistic. It's just, unfortunately, it's part of our evolutionary psychology. And we should get over the idea that we're going to cleanse the human mind to such point that we're all perfectly tolerant people. It's never going to happen, unfortunately.
Michael Coren, you've got a look on your face right now.
Well, I mean, with respect, that's not the intention. First of all, the open wound of gay people not wanting to be with straight people is not really affecting the nation state. I mean, let's take another example. Let's take an example of someone who is deeply homophobic, who says that gay people should be ostracized, beaten, or killed. That's still not uncommon in parts of the world.
But I
even
deliberately
in Canada.
excluded that. I deliberately excluded extreme cases in my preamble.
But John, I
as you'll know.
mean, to be fair, I think the examples you're using are, well, I'm not sure how, obviously they're not mainstream, but with respect, I'm not sure how helpful they are. There is a middle way here. I mean, for example, that graph said if you have radical ideas, I think I have radical ideas. Some of what was concluded in that survey was very worrying. I think it's someone applying perhaps what is a noble thought, but then giving it a certain power and almost violence, the idea of losing your job. If you have persecuted someone who you work with, if you've made them feel acutely uncomfortable, yes, I think there we have a very strong argument. Normally, an expression from someone who is not enormously educated, not very sensitive, this can be solved through argument and discussion. What has happened now, I believe, is that people are overreacting to what is a real problem. The problem is real. There is a great deal of pain and suffering and marginalization out there, but the reaction shouldn't be to punish and chastise, but to try and reason. Doesn't always work, but it can do.
I agree with
that.
There's
an overreaction to a real problem right now.
Sri, let me get Sri in on this. You know, I mean, you will all interpret the numbers the way you want to, but certainly one could interpret those numbers as well, I don't know, evoking Voltaire's, I disapprove of what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it. That notion doesn't seem to have a great deal of currency in Canada anymore if those numbers are accurate. Would you agree?
I don't think Voltaire said that. I think his biographer said that about him.
True.
But I'm actually quite heartened by the idea that 91% of is it Canadians, Ontarians, who think that freedom of speech cannot guarantee freedom from social consequences. I think that's fabulous. I too am worried about the idea that radical ideas should be censored, because if a radical idea is I want to kill 6 million people, yes, it should be censored. But if the radical idea is should we defund the police because that is come up as a solution to help an oppressed group stop their killings at the hands of institutions, yeah, no, that shouldn't be censored. So I don't think we can look at any of these issues unless we consider a framework of a power structure. And in the previous conversation, somebody mentioned class privilege. And I don't think you can look at class privilege unless you see how it intersects with other identities as well. Mm-hmm. And so if people who say offensive ideas should not lose their jobs, let's say, it's never been the case. If somebody calls me the C word at work, then there should be some accountability for it. And that's considered pretty normal, right?
Is that a common phenomenon at the Toronto Star? Is that common workplace dialogue at the Star?
But
okay, good. I'm glad to hear
that. I'm not sure why you would think that.
Because you used it as an example at work.
I gave it as a purely hypothetical example with the word if at the start of my sentence.
But we're using extreme examples here. We're using very extreme examples.
And all of us are, because you mentioned somebody losing jobs because of a single tweet. And yes, I'm sure it happens, but it's such a small fringe example. We could use excesses and keep arguing endlessly. But if we focus on what Michael called the vast middle, then I think we might get to some reasonable ideas. Now, if people express offensive ideas, and of course they shouldn't be using those offensive or let's say discriminatory ideas to actually discriminate. If we say that they should face no consequences, if somebody says a racial slur, what does that actually mean? It means it shows a certain contempt for a race of people. How do you know whether a person in position of power doesn't give another person a promotion? Let's say they're allowed to say, the person in power, a boss, is allowed to say racial slurs, face no consequences for it, and have they discriminated based on race or not? How do you know? There is no way to prove discrimination. One way to monitor that is how we express our ideas, and not being able to say a racial slur is a pretty basic form of control.
Okay, forgive me. I'm going to jump in here. We're down to our last minute. Irshad, it's for you.
Well, I personally have no problem with the idea that there are social consequences for causing grave offense. Here's the issue. If I, as a brown person, repeatedly offend white people by how I express my ideas to them. And I am in a position of some power. Let's say I'm the diversity director at the at my company, or the principal of a high school. Does that mean that I should, as a brown person, incur social consequences? I say yes. In order for any kind of diversity, and that includes diversity of viewpoint, to have credibility, we need to acknowledge that we, when we speak, are individuals. We are not merely mascots of one or another group, oppressed or otherwise. And because we are individuals, we also must take responsibility for how we express ourselves. It's one thing to say, Sri, that white people obviously, should be held to account. It's another to acknowledge that all people should be held to account, regardless of the complexion that they carry. Sure. You may respond, but Irshad, what about power? What about power? I say, this is my view, that power is situational, not static. When you are in a position of power, even if you're not white, you too need to take responsibility for what you say to
and this
people
is where,
over whom you have that authority.
This is where, forgive me, this is where the host comes in and says the power of the clock is absolute. And that is our time. Irshad Manji, Jonathan Kay, Michael Koren, Sri Paradkar. That was an extraordinary conversation, and I'm so grateful all four of you spared some time for us on TVO tonight. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
And we hope you will join us for the next installment of the Democracy Agenda, which airs 2 weeks from tonight. And just a reminder, as part of this partnership, you can also check out my column in the Toronto Star today. And that is the agenda for Thursday, March the 4th, 2021. Tomorrow, the leader of Ontario's official opposition, Andrea Horwath, joins Nam Kiwanuka to hear more about the NDP's assessment of the government's handling of COVID-19 so far. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And Nam, we'll see you here tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.